The defendant is guilty of lewd and lascivious molestation as charged. The defendant is guilty of sexual battery.
A man on trial for raping a teenager is found guilty. Reco Johnson was convicted a short time ago, and yesterday he came face to face with his young victim.
And today the jury delivered his fate. Fox 13's Gloria Gomez shows us what led up to the verdict.
Mr. Johnson,
Reco Johnson got cold feet at the last minute and decided not to testify in his own defense. But he had plenty to say during closing arguments about his innocence.
I'm not guilty of doing anything.
Johnson, who is acting as his own attorney, is accused of raping his ex-girlfriend's 15-year-old daughter while her mother was at work back in April of 2019. The girl told the jury about it, but what made it nearly unbearable was having to answer questions from the man who's accused of raping her.
You said I came in your room and you had your phone in your hand. Do you have any opportunity at any time to call the police?
No, I was too busy telling you to stop and pushing your hands off of me.
Prosecutors say this is not a she said, he said case. There is scientific evidence pointing directly at Johnson.
His specific DNA.
And they urged the jury not to have any sympathy for him.
Mr. Johnson elected to exercise his constitutional right to represent himself. He doesn't get bonus points for that.
Johnson placed all the blame on the young girl, claiming she came on to him.
The real victim, should be found not guilty.
But the jury didn't buy it.
The defendant is guilty of lewd and lascivious molestation as charged. The defendant is guilty of sexual battery.
Now Johnson could be sentenced to decades in prison. Gloria Gomez, Fox 13 News.
And Johnson will be sentenced in February.
In the heart of Florida, under the ordinary hum of daily life, a tragedy was quietly unfolding. One that no one saw coming, but one that would leave scars far deeper than any could imagine. Reco Johnson was a familiar face. To some, he was a friend. To others, a partner. He was the man who once shared a home, shared meals, shared laughter with a woman who trusted him, not just with her heart, but with something far more precious. Her family. He was the ex-boyfriend of a hard-working mother, a man who had walked through her front door, who had known the rhythms of her life and the faces of her children. But when that relationship ended, something shifted. Was it heartbreak? Was it resentment? Or was it something darker? A twisted revenge that no one could have predicted? At the center of this story is a 15-year-old girl, a child on the cusp of becoming a woman, full of dreams, laughter, and innocence. She should have been worried about homework, school dances, and late-night talks with friends. But instead, she was living through a nightmare that would steal her childhood, tarnish her trust, and burden her with a weight no teenager should ever carry. Where was her mother when this happened? She was working, doing everything she could to provide a better life for her family, never imagining that the real danger wasn't out there in the world, but inside her very own home. Where was her father? Was he even in the picture? Where were her siblings, if she had any, when she needed someone to hear her silent cries? She was alone with a man who had no right to her, no claim to her trust, yet took from her something that could never be returned. Think about that. Imagine being 15, standing in your own home, the place that should be your safest refuge, and feeling the ground crumble beneath your feet. Imagine the confusion, the betrayal, the shame. Imagine knowing that the very person who smiled at you in the morning, who maybe even called you by name, was the same person who would leave you with scars that might never fade. Scars that wouldn't just be on your skin, but in your heart, in your mind, in every relationship you'd ever have from that moment forward. And as if that wasn't enough, imagine having to relive it all in a courtroom. Imagine standing there face to face with the man who stole your innocence, as he, not an attorney, not a stranger, but he questions you, challenges you, looks you in the eye as if you were the one on trial. Imagine the strength it took for her to stand there, to speak her truth, while the man who shattered her world tried to twist it, tried to make her question her own reality. But this story isn't just about a crime. It's about trust, broken in the most unimaginable way. It's about a mother who now lives with the guilt of what happened under her roof. It's about a young girl who will carry this burden into adulthood, who will face the stigma, the whispers, the questions of why didn't you tell someone sooner? Or how could this happen? This is the story of Reco Johnson, a man who once walked freely among his community, who looked his ex-girlfriend in the eyes and promised he was a good man. But behind closed doors, when no one was watching, he became something else entirely. And when justice finally came knocking, he didn't just face the law. But she wasn't silent. She spoke, and what she said would send shockwaves through an entire courtroom. This is their story. Reco Johnson wasn't just another man passing through the neighborhood. To those who knew him, he was more than a familiar face. He was the man who once held a place in a family's heart, a partner to a hard-working mother, a presence in the life of her children. He laughed with them, sat at their dinner table, maybe even gave advice or words of comfort when life felt heavy. To outsiders, he might have seemed dependable, trustworthy, even kind. But trust can be the most fragile thing in the world. And when it shatters, it doesn't just break, it explodes, sending fragments into every corner of a person's life. Reco's relationship with the mother wasn't just a fleeting romance. It was woven into the fabric of her home. He knew the routines, the mornings filled with rushed breakfasts, the quiet evenings after work. He knew when she'd be there, and when she wouldn't. But what no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was the darkness he carried beneath that familiar smile. Was his relationship with her built on genuine affection? Or was it a calculated step towards something far more horrifying? When the love faded, did resentment take its place? Was this a man scorned, looking for revenge in the most unimaginable way? Or had this darkness been there all along, waiting for the perfect moment to surface? While the world saw a man who blended into the backdrop of suburban life, one young girl saw something entirely different. But by the time her truth was heard, the damage had already been done. Reco Johnson wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. He wasn't just a face in the crowd. He was the man who would forever change the lives of a mother and her daughter, leaving behind a trail of betrayal and heartbreak that no one could have foreseen. It was April 2019, a typical Florida evening, heavy with humidity, the kind of night where the world feels quiet, as if nothing could possibly go wrong. In a modest home, a 15-year-old girl was left to the usual routine. Her mother was working the night shift, doing everything she could to provide a better life for her family. The house, though silent, felt familiar, safe. After all, home is supposed to be the one place where nothing can touch you. But that night, everything changed. Reco Johnson was no stranger to that house. He knew its creaks, the sound of the old floorboards under his feet, the way the front door clicked shut. He knew the rhythms of that family's life. And as the clock ticked forward, minute by minute, he made a decision that would shatter more than just trust. The young girl, just 15, was supposed to be thinking about school, friends, maybe daydreaming about the future. But instead, she faced something no child should ever endure. The walls of her home. The walls of her home. The ones that should have protected her. Came a prison. The man who once shared dinners and laughs with her family became a predator in the very space she should have felt safest. Imagine the confusion in those first moments, the fear. The realization that something was terribly wrong and there was no one there to stop it. Where was her mother? At work, trying to build a future. Where was her father? Was he even in her life? Where were the people who were supposed to protect her when she needed them most? She was alone, trapped, with no escape from the nightmare unfolding in front of her. The betrayal was more than just physical. It cut into the very fabric of her identity. At an age where she should have been discovering who she was, building her dreams, she was instead forced to carry a weight far too heavy for her young shoulders. A weight of shame, confusion, and fear. The kind that doesn't just fade with time. It lingers, it shapes, it scars. But the horror of that night didn't end when Reco Johnson walked out the door. It didn't end when her mother came home and saw the haunted look in her daughter's eyes. It didn't even end when the police were called and the investigation began. Because what happened next would add another twisted layer to an already unbearable story. Reco Johnson wasn't just accused. He wasn't just brought to trial. He made a decision in that courtroom that would leave everyone stunned. But what made this case even more disturbing wasn't just what Reco Johnson did that night. It was how he faced his own trial. What he did in that courtroom would leave the victim, her family, and the entire community reeling all over again. For a 15-year-old girl, life is supposed to be filled with laughter, school dances, whispered secrets with friends, and dreams of the future. But for her, those ordinary moments were stolen in an instant. The walls of her bedroom, once decorated with posters and memories, now stood as silent witnesses to the night her world was torn apart. She was only 15 when the person she once trusted, someone who had been welcomed into her home, shared meals with her family, maybe even called her by a nickname, added every sense of safety she had ever known. The betrayal wasn't just in the act itself. It was in the trust that was crushed, the innocence that was ripped away, and the sense of security that would never fully return. Imagine waking up the next day knowing your life will never be the same. Imagine walking into school, surrounded by classmates who talk about weekend plans, crushes and exams, while you carry a secret so heavy, it feels like it's written across your skin. But no one can see it. Because the deepest wounds aren't the ones people can point to. They're the ones that live inside, where no one else can reach. She was just a child. But after that night, she had to carry the weight of an adult's trauma. The fear, the shame, the confusion. It all settled into the quiet corners of her mind. Was it her fault? Could she have stopped it? These questions haunt victims long after the world has moved on. And while the case would eventually make headlines, no one outside that house could truly understand the ripple effect of what happened within those walls. Where was her mother, working, trying to keep the family afloat? Where were her friends? Probably just a phone call away, but how do you find the words to explain something like this? And her father? Was he even in the picture? These are the gaps, the absences, that can make a tragedy feel even more isolating. Because even in a crowded room, trauma can make you feel completely alone. But the worst part, the world doesn't stop for pain. The days kept coming. The sun kept rising. She still had to face teachers, neighbors, and family gatherings. While inside, she was screaming. The emotional scars ran deeper than anyone could see. They didn't fade with time. They became part of her story, shaping how she saw herself and the world around her. And as the legal system began to turn its wheels, she was forced to relive every horrifying detail, to stand in a courtroom, face the man who stole her innocence, and tell her story to strangers. A child forced to confront the worst moment of her life, not in the safety of a counselor's office or the comfort of her home, but under the harsh lights of a courtroom, surrounded by people who could never truly understand what she endured. This wasn't just about a crime. This was about a life forever altered, about a girl who would carry the stigma, the shame, and the silence far longer than the headlines would last. And while the justice system would eventually give its verdict, no sentence could ever undo the damage done that night. When the allegations first surfaced, the community was rattled, but investigators wasted no time. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place faster than anyone could have predicted. Behind closed doors, officers worked tirelessly, sifting through the disturbing details that pointed to one man, Reco Johnson. Reco wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. He was someone who had been trusted, someone who had sat at family dinners, shared inside jokes, and blended seamlessly into the fabric of this family's life. But all it took was one night for that facade to crumble. The moment the young girl's story came to light, law enforcement knew they had to act quickly. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated betrayal. Detectives combed through every piece of evidence: text messages, timelines, witness accounts. Each detail painted a clearer, darker picture of what had happened when that house, supposed to be a place of safety, became a prison for an innocent child. The hardest part, facing the reality that someone so close to the family could commit such an unforgivable act. But the true shock wasn't just in the crime itself. It came later, in the cold, sterile walls of the courtroom. When the charges were formally brought against Reco Johnson, the community braced for a traditional legal battle. A defense attorney, cross-examinations, and the usual back and forth of a courtroom drama. But then, Reco made a decision no one saw coming. He chose to represent himself. Imagine that, a man standing in the very room where his darkest secrets were about to be laid bare, choosing to face the court without legal counsel. But it didn't stop there. The most chilling part of all, he didn't just defend himself in front of the jury. He faced his accuser head-on. That young girl, already carrying the unbearable weight of what had happened, was now forced to sit in the same room as the man who had stolen her innocence, and listen as he questioned her, trying to pick apart her story, trying to discredit the truth she was brave enough to share. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Each question he asked wasn't just a legal tactic. It was a cruel reminder of the power he once held over her. The community watched in disbelief as this man, accused of unspeakable crimes, tried to manipulate the narrative right in front of their eyes. But the evidence was overwhelming. No matter how much Reco Johnson tried to twist the story, the facts spoke louder than his words. And as the investigation continued to unfold, the prosecution built a case so solid that even Reco's brazen self-defense couldn't shake it. Still, what happened in that courtroom would haunt everyone who witnessed it, because this wasn't just a trial. It was a public unraveling of a man's deceit, a girl's painful truth, and a community's shattered trust. But no one expected what would happen when he stood in front of the jury and questioned the very girl he was accused of harming. December 2021. The courtroom doors creaked open, and with them came the heavy burden of truth, waiting to be unveiled. The air inside was thick, not just with anticipation, but with the weight of the story about to unfold. This was supposed to be a straightforward trial. The evidence was damning, the victim's testimony unshakable. The community believed this was the moment justice would be served swiftly, decisively. But then, Reco Johnson did the unthinkable. He fired his attorney. It wasn't just a legal move, it was a statement. A man accused of unspeakable crimes stood before the judge and jury, not with a seasoned professional to defend him, but alone, defiant. His decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom, leaving spectators and even legal experts in disbelief. Why would a man, cornered by such overwhelming evidence, choose to stand alone against the system? But the most disturbing part wasn't just that he represented himself. It was how he chose to handle his defense. Reco Johnson didn't just argue his innocence from a distance. He crossed a line many believed should never be crossed. He stood, looked his victim in the eyes, and began to question her. The very girl who had bravely come forward to expose the nightmare she endured was now forced to relive it, not just through testimony, but through direct confrontation with the man who had shattered her world. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence with each word he uttered. It wasn't just the legal process unfolding. It was a raw public display of manipulation and control. The young girl, barely holding herself together, sat in the witness stand, facing not just the trauma of recounting her story, but the unbearable tension of being interrogated by the man who caused it. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The prosecution watched with thinly veiled disgust. Even the judge, bound by legal protocols, couldn't mask the unease in the room. Each question Reco asked felt like another wound being reopened, not just for the victim, but for everyone who had come hoping to see justice served without further pain. Reco's defense strategy wasn't about facts or evidence. It was about intimidation, about exerting whatever twisted sense of power he had left. But what he didn't count on was the resilience of the girl he tried to break. She answered his questions with a quiet, steady voice, her courage cutting through the tension like a blade. Each word she spoke wasn't just testimony, it was defiance. As the trial progressed, it became clear Reco Johnson wasn't just on trial for his crimes. He was exposing himself in real time. His arrogance and lack of remorse laid bare for everyone to see. The jury saw it, the community saw it, and most importantly, the victim saw it. She faced him, unflinching, while he crumbled under the weight of his own lies. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a psychological war, one that Reco Johnson was destined to lose. The courtroom sat in a heavy, suffocating silence. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with anticipation. After days of harrowing testimony and Reco Johnson's unsettling, defiant self-defense, it all came down to this moment. The jury had retreated behind closed doors, tasked with making a decision that would forever define the lives of everyone involved. Hours felt like days. The ticking of the courtroom clock became a steady reminder that justice was looming, just out of reach, but inevitable. Inside the jury room, 12 strangers sat with the weight of a community on their shoulders. They had heard every word, seen every piece of evidence, watched the young girl bravely recount the unimaginable. They had witnessed Reco Johnson, not just as an accused man, but as someone who dared to confront his own victim with chilling disregard for her pain. The deliberations weren't about if he was guilty. They were about how profoundly guilty he was. Back in the courtroom, the victim's family sat in tense silence. The young girl, who had faced her abuser with unimaginable courage, stared at the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. Another clutched her hand tightly, silently praying that justice would finally be delivered. The entire community waited, their breath held in unison, knowing that whatever the verdict, the scars would remain. Then the door creaked open. The jury had reached a decision. Reco Johnson, still representing himself, stood motionless. No fear, no remorse, just the same unsettling calm he'd maintained throughout the trial. The judge called the courtroom to order, and the foreperson of the jury rose, a folded piece of paper trembling slightly in their hand. On the charge of sexual battery of a minor, we find the defendant guilty. The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. But the foreperson wasn't done. On the charge of lewd and lascivious molestation, guilty. On the charge of sexual assault, guilty. One by one, each count was read aloud, each guilty striking like a hammer against the fragile hope that Reco might somehow walk free. But now there was no escape. The evidence had spoken. The victim had spoken. And now the jury had spoken. Reco Johnson showed no reaction, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd inflicted, but his silence spoke volumes. The mask he wore throughout the trial had finally crumbled, leaving behind nothing but the cold, undeniable truth of his guilt. In the gallery, the young girl's mother broke into quiet tears, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. It wasn't just relief, it was the release of years of pain, fear, and uncertainty. For the first time since that horrible night, there was a sense of closure. But the emotional scars would remain, etched deep into the fabric of their lives. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of the verdict lingered. Justice had been served, but the echoes of Reco Johnson's betrayal would continue to haunt everyone who had been touched by this case. The community, once trusting and close-knit, had been forever changed. And for one brave young girl, life would never be the same. But at least now she could begin to heal, knowing that her voice had been heard and that the man who tried to silence her would never hurt anyone again. March 2022. The day that would mark the end of one chapter, but far from the end of the pain that would echo through the lives of those involved. Reco Johnson stood before the judge one final time. The weight of his actions, now finally about to meet the consequences. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of anxious anticipation, the air thick with the gravity of what was about to unfold. But this time, there was no defense, no more arguments, no more denial. Just the inevitable reckoning for a man who had torn apart the life of a young girl and shattered the trust of a mother who had once loved him. As the judge read the sentencing, each word seemed to carry the full weight of the crime. 35 years. 35 years for the abuse, for the irreversible damage caused. The sentence echoed in the stillness of the courtroom, marking a moment that would forever change the lives of the victim and her family. But for the girl who had once trusted the man who now stood before the judge, it wasn't enough to undo the pain, the shame, or the scars that would last a lifetime. And in the midst of it all, the victim's mother stood at the podium, her face hidden, but her voice breaking through the silence with a powerful testament to the toll this had taken on her family. Through tears and quiet sobs, she spoke of the nightmares, the sleepless nights, the struggles to rebuild a life that had been torn apart. Her words were raw, full of grief and disbelief. How could the man she had once loved, the man who had shared her life, now stand accused of something so heinous? She spoke for her daughter, no longer the innocent girl she had been before that fateful night. She spoke for the trust that had been shattered, for the darkness that had tainted their once bright future. And as the judge delivered his final words, there was no comfort, no closure. The pain of the victim and her family, along with the anguish of the community who had once trusted him, would linger far beyond the courtroom walls. As Reco Johnson was escorted away, the courtroom began to empty. People left with solemn faces, their expressions a mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but the scars of this case would never fade. For some, the horror of it all would be carried in the quiet corners of their minds forever, wondering how someone they knew, someone they trusted, could have done something so devastating. But for the victim, there was a small semblance of closure, a chance to heal, however long that journey may take. The man who had once stood at the center of their lives, now condemned to live the rest of his days behind bars. But even in the aftermath, a question remains. How many more are hiding in plain sight? How many trusted faces, once thought safe, could be hiding a darkness no one sees? For the victim, justice was served, but the wounds remain. The truth has been laid bare, the man who betrayed her trust now behind bars. Yet, no sentence can ever undo the damage that has been done. No amount of time can heal the deep scars that have been left behind. This case was not just about a crime. It was about the shattering of a young girl's world, the loss of innocence, and the broken trust that she will carry with her for the rest of her life. The girl who had once been carefree, full of dreams and hopes for the future, now carries a weight no child should ever bear. She showed incredible bravery when she stood up in that courtroom, facing the very man who had taken so much from her. In that moment, she wasn't just a victim. She was a warrior. But behind the courage was the quiet knowledge that her life had irrevocably changed. Another, her protector, had failed her. And in a way, the entire world had too. How could someone they trusted, someone they allowed into their home, do something so horrific? The man who had once shared their space, their meals, their laughter, was now the monster who had stolen a piece of their hearts forever. And the community, once a place where they felt safe, surrounded by familiar faces, now seemed alien. How could they have been so blind? The man they had all known, trusted, and perhaps even loved, had now shown them a side they never could have imagined. This was more than a crime against one girl. It was a crime against an entire community's trust. A stain that would linger for years to come, leaving behind the question that nobody knew how to answer. How could we have missed it? The victim will carry this burden for the rest of her life. The courage she found in herself to testify will serve as a lifeline, but it doesn't erase the pain, the trauma. What the community must now reckon with is not just the reality of a crime, but the stark truth that evil can exist where we least expect it. That sometimes the people we trust the most can be the ones who hurt us the most. As for Reco Johnson, he will spend the next 35 years in prison, facing the consequences of his actions. But for the victim, this is not the end. The healing process will be long, and the scars will never truly fade. She may one day find peace, but it will be a different kind of peace than she once dreamed of. What remains now is reflection on what happened, on what could have been different, and on what the community will learn from this tragedy. This story doesn't end with a sentence. It ends with a question. How many more victims are out there hiding in plain sight? Reco Johnson's story is a chilling reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they are right in front of us, wearing faces we think we know, faces we trust, faces that are meant to protect us. But when those we rely on for safety become the source of our greatest pain, the world as we know it shatters. This case isn't just a story of one man's actions. It's a painful reflection on the hidden dangers that can exist in even the most familiar places. It's a wake-up call, one that reminds us that evil can exist in plain sight, hiding behind the normalcy of everyday life. If this story moved you, if it caused you to reflect on the people in your life and question the trust you place in others, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation, because these stories are not just about the crimes. They are about the courage it takes to speak out and seek justice. And if you want more true crime stories, the ones that uncover the hidden truths buried beneath the surface of our communities, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. We owe it to the victims to keep their voices heard. Until next time, stay aware and stay safe. Because sometimes the truth is scarier than fiction.